while a sage or an enlightened person or an awake person or a self-realized person is still a person, the difference, and they answer to their name, right? And they identify with their body, right? They do. They still take showers, you know, they get health checkups and so forth and so on. So they identify with name and form. The thing that's different is they know that while they're being a person, they know that the person is a functional vehicle. It's a functional reality that's necessary to be in time and space and be in the world. The difference between a person who's self-realized or enlightened and anybody else is that they're not attached to what's happening. They're not suffering from whether or not they're doing things right or wrong. They're not suffering from whether they're too fat or too skinny, or they're not suffering from whether what happened today should have been different. They're not suffering from, you know, the thinking about the mistakes they made in their life, and, you know, that I was a failure as a husband because my marriage didn't work. They're not worried about, you know, what's going to happen tomorrow. Even in the case of sages or aware or enlightened people who have been diagnosed with terminal illness, as was the case with Ramana Maharshi, as was the case with Nisargadatta. Well, really, as is the case with all of us, right? Sooner or later, right? But even when, see, that's when there's gratitude. That's when there's a real appreciation. When you get hit between the eyes with a terminal diagnosis, right? That's when there's real gratitude, right? Because if that happens, and the way that gets received is that that's just information, right? Then obviously you have transcended the idea that you're a person. So the difference between a regular person and somebody who is a sage, and therefore the difference between whether somebody who is a sage is speaking as a person or not, is they're being a person, and whatever comes out of their mouth is coming from the source. Why? Because the thing that makes them different is they know that they're not a person really, and therefore, and they know that they have no, I keep coming back to this, it must be in the cards, right, so to speak. Thy will be done. They know that they have no free will. They know that everything is predestined. And that's what I mean when I say they don't have any regrets about the past or concerns about the future, right? If they get a diagnosis of terminal illness, right, that's the will of God, or that's the source, or that's the cosmic law expressing itself. And because because that's really the essential difference, because they've really surrendered completely to the idea that they don't have free will. They completely surrendered to the idea of the body's death. They've completely surrendered to life as life exists. There are no surprises, there are no regrets, there's no concern. So for a sage, for example, if they were to get a terminal diagnosis, right, they probably wouldn't ask what the prognosis was. Why would they? What?
Would they be curious?
Curious about what? But there's no way for anybody to know what's going to happen. That's what they know. How many times have people been given a prognosis that they were going to die and they didn't die? Or a prognosis that they were going to live for 5 years and they died in 2 weeks? If you were to do a statistical analysis of the predictions the doctors make about how long a person's going to live compared to how long they live, they'd be way off all the time. The ego wants to know, is there a way to accomplish this without dealing with the truth? Right? Is there a way to accomplish this by, I mean, that's one of the ways the ego survives, right, is by attempting to avoid reality, which tranquilizers help with, right? Right? Because what do? They sedate. They sedate. Yeah, you can change the brain's chemistry, and because you change the brain's chemistry, the degree to which you're awake or aware gets sedated, gets shut down. But when you turn your car engine off, it doesn't make the car disappear. Right? When you turn the car engine off, it doesn't make the car disappear. So your body, your ego and your person will be here as long as there's a body. And that's important to understand, because a lot of people are under the misconception that what this is all about is getting rid of the ego. If you get rid of the ego, right, then how do you function in the world? Right? Because the ego is the person. The problem isn't that there's an ego. The problem is that the ego thinks that it is reality. You understand? The problem isn't that there's an ego. The problem is that the ego thinks it's real. And even though all you have to do to find out the truth is pay attention and look, the evidence is clear. As I have said many times before, the evidence is very clear that all there is awareness and what's happening. That's all there is. The idea that you're involved, that you're aware, is an inference. It's a belief. There is no evidence for it. It doesn't actually exist. However, even though it doesn't exist in reality, in actuality, right, like the physical body exists as a phenomenal reality, right, even though it doesn't exist in that regard, right, it does exist in terms of it being a psychological condition that's necessary for you to operate in the world as we know it. Why did God, here's a question that some people ask, if the ego is such a problem in terms of our believing that we are the ego and the ego is real when it's not, if that's such a problem, right, why did God create the ego? If you want to talk about it in terms of God or the source or consciousness, why? What was the purpose of the creation of the ego? Why not just have people know the truth? Right? It's a good question, right? See, but if the ego didn't get created and what you were was what you actually are, which is consciousness itself, survival wouldn't be an issue. What could happen to consciousness? So then the question is, so what's the purpose of the ego? Why would God create the ego? Why does the ego exist? It's a good question, right? It's true that we can't know with any degree of certainty what the author of the book was doing when he created the characters in the story, right?
Because that will be done.
That's right. However, there are things that we can conceptualize that are a pretty good fit for why the ego was created. So that and it's just like, as you mentioned with Ramesh Balsekar, he says everything I say is a concept. You may agree or not agree with the concept. If you don't agree with the concept, so that's the end of it right there. You might as well go do something else. If you do agree with the concept, that's still not the end, because The concept is just a concept. It's not the truth. If you do agree with the concept, then what you want to do is you want to personally investigate that concept to see, does that concept fit? Does it work in your actual moment-to-moment, day-to-day experience? If it works, that's a pretty good indicator that the concept's got validity, yes? Yeah. If your theory about how a combustion engine works when you build it and turn it on, that's a pretty good indication that you're on, that you're onto something, right? So in terms of the ego, it's necessary, in order for life to occur the way it does, and what I mean by that is the way life occurs that you and I are separate from one another, right? And that we're separate from the world, right? In order for that to be the case, in order for interpersonal reality, for us to be able to relate to one another, and for us to be in time and in a world that's separate from us, in order for life to occur the way it does, there has to be an ego. If you didn't experience yourself as being separate from other people, if there was no time, which is getting generated by your brain, by the way, and space, if there was no time and space and there was no separate person and you weren't separate from the world, the game's over. There's no game. There is no life as we experience it. So the ego has to occur, just like opposites have to exist, right? Right? Without up, there can't be down. Without love, without hate, there can't be love. Without pleasure, there can't be pain. Without death, there can't be life. All of the opposites are necessary for the existence of the manifest world. They're necessary. And the ego is necessary as well, right? So it's just the cosmic law. The cosmic law, or you could say it's the part of the principle of the source. It's part of the principle of God, that when the unmanifest potential energy manifests, certain laws have to be met for that to happen. And one of those laws is that you have to experience yourself as being separate from other people. Something about that. We think about evolution as if, oh, that took billions of years, right? There is no time. There is no time. It happened, it's happening, all happened now. And everything that will happen in the future has happened. That's tough for the brain to get, right? That's tough for the mind to get, right? But if you can get that time is not real, that's not hard, is it? To get the time is not real? I mean, all you have to do to get the time is not real is just notice the fact that in Europe, it's a different time than it is here. That's all you have to get, is that it's just made up, right? Different, the Jewish calendar is different from the Christian calendar, right? It's, daylight savings time was made up, for convenience sake. We just changed the time. So if time isn't real, if you can get the time isn't real, then if time isn't real, then what is the case if there's no time? If there's no time, it must therefore mean that whatever we think has happened and will happen and is happening is all the same thing. So evolution, right? So evolution is happening now. And whatever will evolve into the future is happening now. And if it's all predetermined, right? If it's all predetermined, right? Then the reality of it is that you're witnessing something that's already complete, already happened, already the way it is, and you just keep noticing that, your attention keeps moving with that, looking at that, rather than that moving. There is no way out. It's inevitable that you have to come into being conditioned. You have to be conditioned. You have to function in the world. And so by being conditioned, what does that mean? You go to school, right? You learn how to behave. You learn what's right and wrong. You learn what not to do and what to do. And then your superego develops, and you start having concern about your doing things wrong and making mistakes and being a bad kid, and it goes on like that. And of course, in terms of this whole business of predetermination, if it is the will of God, or if it is the will of the source or cosmic law, you know, that at some point you hear the truth, and when you hear the truth, you recognize it, right? Then that's the beginning of the awareness waking up. And again, as I have said to you before, if that's the case, your sitting here right now is not an accident. If that's the case, you have been attracted to the truth because you recognized it, you heard it and you recognized it, and therefore you are among the people who have begun to wake up. When you become a seeker, you know, again, in reference to this whole business of there being no doer, your becoming a seeker just happened to you. It just happened. And the fulfillment of that is also predetermined. For some people, the process will continue until it's fulfilled and you are awakened, right? Like the Buddha. See, the Buddha wasn't special. The Buddha wasn't special. One of the reasons the Buddha taught after the Buddha realized the truth was because he saw that everybody was the Buddha. He wasn't special. Everybody was the Buddha. And so it was his predestination to create a teaching, to create the Dharma, to create a way to share what he experienced so that other people could have the experience. And based on the will of God or the will of the source or cosmic law, people will wake up depending upon their destiny. Some will wake up fully and be fully realized. Others will wake up to some degree. You know, and you will see it. You will see it. As you wake up, you will see people around you who are less awake than you and more awake than you. You'll see that around you. And the thing about it is, regardless of what degree of awakening occurs for you, right? If you are awake enough to understand what's happening and appreciate what's happening, right? Then you have gratitude. Because to the degree that you are awake is to the degree that you have less suffering. Yes? To the degree that you have less suffering. And when you come to the understanding that it's possible for there to be no suffering, then if it's your destiny and you hear that, if it's your destiny and you hear that, right, then you will begin to act accordingly in terms of behaving in a way that's consistent with realizing that completely. In other words, you will do whatever occurs to you to do, whatever appears to be relevant to that, you will naturally do. Meaning, it may mean you read books about it, it may mean that you go to retreats, it may mean that you listen to teachers talk, it may mean that you practice meditation, right? But whatever it is that you do, it'll be coming from that understanding, and that understanding being heard by you in such a way that you recognize that there is nothing more important than waking up completely. And that understanding that there is nothing more important than waking up completely will begin to become the primary motivation for you. Primary motivation. You will wake up in the morning with that intention. And as you go through the day, you'll be paying attention with that intention. You'll be watching your mind, and when your mind gets upset, you know, when you're angry, when you get upset, you'll be looking at it from that intention, in terms of realizing that it's possible to be free of that by seeing it for what it is, right? And no longer getting involved with it. Seeing it for what it is and no longer getting involved with it. And if you don't get involved with it, it will die its own death. If you don't get involved with it, if you stop repeating the neural patterns that come up to get played in your brain, those neural patterns will naturally die out. That's called neuroplasticity. And what will replace those neural patterns are neural patterns that are related to reality, related to the way things really are. So you will have an enlightened brain. If the person is seen not to be real, right? If you surrender to thy will be done, if you surrender, you know, to the source, right? Then whether the person loses their fear of public speaking or not is dependent upon their destiny. But they will no longer be concerned about whether they do or not. And of course, you know, and then there's the other factor, and that is that, you know, you could say that your destiny is a function of your conditioning in your DNA as a person, okay? But isn't what you are doing right now reconditioning you? Yeah. So while that's the case, that conditioning and the neuroplasticity of the brain means that it's always changing. Well, not for everybody. For some people, it's just repeating the same shit every day. Different day, same shit. You hear people say that, don't you? Right? But if you start to come out of that and you start to hear the message and you get the invitation, right? And your brain starts changing, you're reconditioning the conditioning that's determining what you do and determining who you are and determining the experience you're having of yourself in your life. Therefore, anything's possible. At the same time, anything's possible, it's all predetermined.
I have a hard time with that predetermination.
Well, the thing about it is, the idea with predetermination is you have to, given that the person will reject it, right? The person will not allow you to understand that. It just won't make any sense, right? But if you're persistent and you pay attention to the evidence which says that it's true, you can get to a point where you do have the conviction and accept that it's true. And part of what it takes to get to the point where you do have the conviction and realize it's true and live consistent with that is to accept that while that's the case in your moment-to-moment life, you still must act as if it's not true. You have to function in the world. You must, once you understand the truth of there being no free will and everything being predetermined, you continue to live the same way. You still think about what you're going to do, you still make choices and decisions, but you understand the truth. That's the difference. And so even though you do that, you're not carrying the load anymore. You don't carry the load anymore. You can look at what's happening. Once you're in that, once you're experiencing that to be true, you can look at what's happening, and when something terrible happens, you can say it's the will of God. But only if when something wonderful happens, you can also say it's just the will of God. You don't get to take credit for the good shit or the bad shit. But look at where that leaves you, right? Look at where that leaves you. No suffering. That's enlightenment. So you can hold on to the idea that you have free will and you are a doer and things aren't predetermined, and keep suffering. It's up to you. Keep suffering. All right, on that note, see you next time.